Welcome back to the Seek of Strength YouTube. Today's episode is a continuation of the beginner's guide to insert blank piece of a lifting equipment. Today's episode is on lifting belts. Basically what we have is kind of three different kind of belts. So we have a Velcro belt,
Yep.
single prong weightlifting tapered belt, so it's kind of wider at the back and tapered down at the front. And then we have the classic uniform all around
Big thicky.
big thicky double prong exclusively powerlifting belt. Essentially no one else uses this kind of belt.
Also, the big thicky powerlifting belt also goes to lever belt. And we've kind of thrown both of those into the same category.
Basically with these three belts, essentially they kind of fall into the three different gym based sports that we kind of typically talk about. So our powerlifters, weightlifters and crossfitters, they kind of all have their own belt that they'll use more than likely. So if we start with powerlifters, because it's probably the most it's the most uniform one, it's the most exclusive group when it comes to that double prong or lever belt. So that big thick belt, they're usually a couple of mils thick, uniform height all the way around the belt, is basically the exclusive domain of our powerlifters across all spectrum of powerlifting. The reason for this is essentially you don't need a lot of room for movement. You don't need to be, you're moving through a single plane of movement. If you're on the bench, you're not even moving at all. And I know some people do wear those benching.
Yeah.
But for squatting and deadlifting, it's a very, very shallow range of movement. You don't need a lot of upper body mobility. For your squats, you're not looking for restrictive movements at your ass to grass squat. You're literally just looking for a parallel squat with that belt.
Yeah. So the advantages of the powerlifting belt is it's incredibly rigid. So rigidity in a belt, obviously, if you're talking about like the height of the belt, you want it to be very, very rigid. So if you were to hold onto the belt and squeeze it down like that, the belt wouldn't cup or it wouldn't kind of roll up. And out of all three, the lever belt or the double prong kind of wide, usually leather belt is going to be by far the most rigid. And that's what you're looking for. You're looking for, in terms of compressing it height-wise, you want it to be very rigid. Usually they're pretty rigid to actually pull around you as well. So that's the first thing. They're very, very rigid. So it means when you're trying to bend over, when the weight is pulling you over, because it's so rigid vertically, it will keep you more upright. So the next pro then will be the fact that, so bracing against a belt is a skill. People most of the time will put on a belt, or some people in certain groups will put on a belt when they're going for a PB. They mightn't touch a belt for the rest of the year, the rest of the training cycle. Whereas with powerlifters in particular, because their skill is going for that maximum 1RM, they get very, very good at using the particular setting on the belt. They usually won't differ at all. Like, it's not like they'll keep tightening it up tighter and tighter as they go to a competition. Most of the time, you'll set especially with a lever belt, you'll set it at one setting, and then you get very good at the routine of bracing against the belt, pushing your erectors out against the belt, pushing your abs against the belt, and the routine and the skill itself of bracing becomes very ingrained due to the fact the belt is so rigid and it's always set at the same position.
So a con of this belt, right, is if you're someone, a powerlifter or not, if you use this kind of belt, is due to the nature of its rigidity. So it gives you such a support that when you train without this, you can kind of become, whether it's physiologically or psychologically reliant on the belt. Sometimes you can end up being over-reliant on this support. So like when you leave home first, you have to do your own washing. Sometimes you don't have your mother anymore. So when you're doing your squats without your belt or your deadlifts, you become over-reliant on this kind of huge amount of support, because it gives, due to its nature and what it's supposed to do, is it does very well. So then when you train, if you train with this too much or exclusively, you do most of your sets. So if you start putting this on at above 50% or whatever, or even earlier than that, or you start doing your assistance exercises, your lunge with this belt on, you kind of end up being a little bit too reliant on this, in terms of, you know, if you don't have it someday, you maybe feel like it's almost a shock if you have to train without this kind of belt, because it's such a difference between when you put this belt on, you tighten it and you're supportive with it, as opposed to squatting and deadlifting without this belt on.
Absolutely. I think, like, the thing on that is we get powerlifters and we get them to do like 5 inchworms, or you get them to do a side plank, and they're like deadlifting 250 kilos and they can't do a side plank for 30 seconds. You know, like, you're really missing out on something there, and the belt could be the cause of that.
So I know some people will argue that wearing a belt doesn't make your core muscles weaker, your midline weaker, but We would argue that I'd say it's not so easy a scenario to be like it definitely doesn't or it definitely does.
Yeah.
I reckon, and we both would kind of come to the agreement that if you are using it too much, you're probably missing out on certain aspects of your core work. Like it's hard to argue against that. If you have a physical sport around your musculature, you may be missing out on certain areas if you're not training without it. So even if what you do is once or twice a week you train without it, or you just do certain warm-ups without it, and I think you could negate the cons pretty well while still getting all the pros if you put on appropriately.
Absolutely. So what's the next kind of belt?
So the next belt is just somewhere in between the Velcro and the Prong, and it's the Tapered weightlifting belt. Basically, this is exclusively the domain of weightlifters again. We sometimes see our CrossFitters use it again, like they might use a Prong belt or the Velcro belts. We almost never see powerlifters wearing the single Prong tapered weightlifting belts. Oftentimes they're always leather basically. You never see them with fake leather or anything like that, obviously, or synthetic materials. They're almost always leather belts with a little bit of padding on the inside. For the reason basically weightlifters need a little bit less of support with the belt is because they need more range of motion when they're going through, a deep squat. Some weightlifters even use it for snatching, but most weightlifters keep it for their deadlifts, squats, and their full clean and jerks. So when you get to the bottom of that, you need a little bit more room in your abdominal area to appropriately hit positions.
Yeah. So the real simple way of thinking about why it tapers around when it comes around the front. So obviously at the back you want as high as the weightlifting rules will allow you. So I think it's 11 centimeters, somewhere around there, 11 or 13. When it comes around to the front, if we had 11 or 13 centimeters at the front and I'm bending down or I'm addressing the bar to pick up the bar in my first pull, that 11 centimeters is going to catch me somewhere between my hip crease and my rib cage. So that's why, like, if you were to wear one of the big powerlifting belts, you will feel severely kind of restrained in the bottom position. And then obviously in the catch position, it's going to be the same thing again. If you're squatting as deep as possible and trying to get as much range of motion as possible, so if you're an inch or two lower, you can snatch more weight or clean more weight. That little bit of relief around the front makes it a bit easier.
The pros of using the single prong tapered weightlifting belt when you're doing your actual weightlifting movements is that it does give you that more range of motion like we just discussed there, so you have more room for it while you still get very, very good support. You get more support than you actually probably need in theory, because obviously the weights are less heavy, or absolute weight is less than it would be compared to your heavy squat or your heavy deadlift, or in comparison to a powerlifter's heavy squat or heavy deadlift.
Yeah, I think one of the cons of the single prong weightlifting leather belt is that you don't get much support in certain positions, right? So it's obviously at a certain setting you don't really have, or you have very little control over where those settings are. So a lot of the time you see a weightlifter bending down to pick up a clean, you'll actually see a bit of a gap between the weight and the belt and their lower back as they're kind of setting up for the pull. So it's just one of those things, because those holes are at certain spacings, and you don't really have the ability to put extra holes in unless it's at the end or at the start of the series. You can't get it bang on every time, but that may not be a bad thing. Very, very rarely will you be cinching down on a weightlifting belt before you go for a clean or even before you go for a squat.
So the reason, for example, our powerlifters wouldn't use this weightlifting belt, so this would be a con for them, is that they get less support for basically no more benefits. So they don't need that extra range of motion, essentially. If anything, that extra range of motion is probably useless to them, or it's almost making the lift a little bit harder if they get that extra range of motion. So if they're restricted a little bit, it works a little bit better, especially, for example, in heavy deadlifts. So it doesn't benefit them at all to wear a tapered weightlifting belt, but they might actually lose some of that that rigidity that would get from a double prong thicker belt.
The last thing I'd say would be a pro of the single prong tapered weightlifting belt would be longevity. If you get one of these leather belts and it's like a high quality one, like the hook grip one or the Rogue belt, these belts could feasibly last you for a decade of training.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that, like with the Velcro belts, it happens with the lever belts as well, where the mechanisms kind of get loose and you have to tighten them up. They don't last as long, and certainly like the rigidity in the powerlifting belts doesn't stay there for the length of its career. Whereas with the more flexible weightlifting belts, you can use that to its full potential for years and years and years.
So lastly, we have our Velcro weightlifting belt, or exclusively weightlifters or powerlifters or Lastly, we have our Velcro belt. So this is usually the cheapest belt you can get. I got one from Strength Shop I think years ago for literally €20, and it lasted for at least 3 or 4 years. So it's a great value for money. You get less support than you would, but in reality, unless you're going for super heavy squats and deadlifts, you don't need that much support if you're using this belt. So you're doing snatches, cleans. Most often we see CrossFitters wearing these. We do see some very good weightlifters actually wearing Velcro belts because they know they don't need a huge amount of support. Someone like Alien or Miso Asana, so our lighter weight class belts or lighter weight class lifters would wear these Velcro belts because you still get that kind of psychological feeling of support. You got something just to brace against. So you're not actually getting a physical support from the structure of the belt. Rather, you're just getting something that's nice to push against so you can brace against it if you tie it appropriately. So belts are cheap. They give you that psychological support, but you still get a huge amount of range of motion. They're very, very cheap and they're very easy to put on and off.
Yeah, so this is the belt that I use for my training. I got one a few weeks ago for like 17.80 or 17.95 or something. They're really cheap. They are in some way a disposable item. So like it's just something you have to admit that like once you have one of those belts for a year and a half or 2 years of anyway consistent training, the Velcro just goes loose in them. I think so. As Gareth was saying, it is like kinesthetic cueing more than anything else. It's like wearing a lighter pair of knee sleeves. They give you the feeling of pushing against something, whereas they don't give you as much support as the others. The reason I prefer a Velcro belt is I don't feel as restricted as I feel with like a leather belt. I would have worn a leather belt when I did the powerlifting training for a while, and I've worn your leather tapered belt. I just prefer the feeling and the fit of a Velcro belt.
So one of the major cons of a Velcro belt is, and we often see this with people who use them, is so rather than tying it appropriately and then leaving a little gap, like we mentioned with the tapered weightlifting belt, what people do is they tie it as tight as possible, so you're actually shrinking your waistline. It's almost like a waist trainer. So then it feels like you've something tight, but you're actually just shrinking things in and you're not pushing out in things. So you want to be able to push out to the maximum range of your abdominal muscles. So you want to easily reach their maximum range of motion, and then just a little bit tighter than that. So when you push out into it, you're pushing against the belt, and the belt is kind of constricting against you, so there's kind of constant pressure. But too often we see people is cinch them as tight as possible because we have no basically belt holes. You can just tie it as tight. The range of motion for the belt is pretty unlimited in terms of like whatever your size is appropriate for you. So oftentimes you see people tie this too tight. You see this across a lot of like beginners and intermediate lifters, and then you end up with just crushing your internal organs essentially, and you're not actually getting much support, and you're probably reducing your ability to breathe correctly.
Yeah, you also lose the skill of bracing, because that, like, whatever about if a powerlifter trains with a really supportive belt, they mightn't be getting quite the amount of stimulus they would be if they didn't wear a belt. Whereas if you're like literally cinching everything down with a Velcro belt, you take out your need to support. So like that skill and that kind of constant cueing yourself to do it just goes away completely. And then you do get somebody who's squatting without a belt because they forgot to bring it to the gym, and they are in Ireland what we'd call lapsy pa, which is very, very weak and floppy.
So overarching then the final point that's very, very important, that which you mentioned, are knee sleeves and knee wraps, is if you're wearing a belt, you should never wear a belt to cover up any kind of back pain. So if you're wearing a belt and it hides back pain from you while you're wearing it, but if you were to do the lift without the belt on and you experience pain, you're almost certainly asking for a lot of trouble. So we always recommend that if you've any kind of pain, go address the pain. Don't do your lifts, continue on with them with your belt on. So unless you're training for the Olympics and it's the game day, don't wear the belts to cover up pain. It's just a terrible idea, and it's a road to disaster, and you'll almost certainly make the problem worse in the long run, because what's happening is you're still irritating your injury, but it might not feel painful now. It's almost certainly making it a little bit worse. Thanks for watching. Next week will be straps. I said it very aggressively. Straps.